Hello and welcome to this webinar on photographic prints. Prints are likely to make up the largest part of your photographic collection, but have you ever thought about the different types and how they might vary? How do you recognise them? What causes them to deteriorate? In this webinar I'm going to give you some pointers so you can start to get to grips with your photographic prints. So let's look at the image forming component first. Here you have a mixture of examples from the 19th century to the late 20th century, divided simply into black and white processes, one colour processes and multicolour processes. As I said before, black and white is a term that is used to describe silver processes in photography, and you may be able to create nominally black and white images in the other categories. The term alternative processes is used to describe one colour images other than silver, and so we can summarise what you've just seen visually represented like this. So black and white are silver, alternative processes have images made from pigment or metals or metal compounds, and multicolour processes have images made from pigments or dyes. We can also divide up prints by the number of layers there are. So here we have one layer prints which just consist of the chemical that forms the image, which is embedded in the paper base. And then there are two layer prints, and here you have a paper layer and an emulsion or binder containing the image forming substance, and the paper fibres may be still somewhat visible. Here we have prints with 3 layers or more, and there can be a variety of extra layers added for different practical purposes. And one of the most common of these is the baryta layer, which is a white pigment layer of barium sulfate in gelatin, and it's often found in later silver prints, and it was added to give a uniform, smooth, plain white background, removing the effect of the paper surface and any colour variation. So let's go back to the silver processes, as that's an obvious place to start. These were the backbone of photography in the 19th century and much of the 20th century. There are 3 ways of forming a silver image which depend on the processing, but with prints you're almost entirely concerned with 2, resulting in printed out prints and developed out prints, and this explains the difference between the 2. So with printed out prints you expose a negative in contact with printing paper until the image appears, and then it's fixed, washed and dried. Whereas with developed out prints you expose a smaller negative in an enlarger raised above the printing paper. You expose it briefly to form a latent image which isn't visible to the human eye, and then the image is brought out by chemical development, and then a stop bath is used to stop the development, and then it's fixed, washed and dried. The significance of this is that in printed out prints you produce silver in the form of small spherical particles, and that's what gives a printed out print its sepia coloration, whereas in developed out prints you have silver in the form of large filaments, and that gives it a black appearance or in the darker, denser areas of the print. So if we look at those prints from the beginning again, you can see on the left you have printed out images and on the right you have developed out images. Because the silver particles in printed out images are smaller, it means that a higher proportion of the silver in a printed out image is on the surface of the particles, making it much more susceptible to chemical attack. And consequently, many printed out prints were gold toned to reduce the rate of deterioration. These survive better and have a slightly maroon tint. However, they are not as resistant to chemical attack as developed out prints. Deterioration-wise, you see a variety of phenomena such as noticeable fading and loss of detail in the highlights of printed out prints, and you can see that in the face of the woman on the left. This is so common it can often be used as a means of identification. The most common form of deterioration seen in developed out prints is tarnish, which appears as a metallic sheen on the surface, more prominently in the darker areas, and again can be used as an aid to identification. Right, I'll talk about the printed out prints first. The earliest printed out print processes, invented by William Henry Fox Talbot in the 1830s and 40s, the photogenic drawing and the salted paper print, did not have an emulsion. However, the next three printed out print processes, albumen, collodion and gelatin, did, and they are known by the name of their emulsion. As they're all printed out prints, they generally share the same colour, tones and silver image deterioration. Here we have a selection of albumen prints, and albumen was introduced in 1850. Albumen tends to yellow more than other emulsions, and it also doesn't like an alkaline environment, which will cause it to yellow more. And it tends to have a finely cracked emulsion, as you can see on the right hand side. Collodion was introduced in 1864, but really took off in the 1880s and was around until World War I, and it can have any sort of surface finish, matte or glossy. Gelatin printing out paper was introduced in 1882 and slowly petered out from the turn of the century, and are quite unusual from the 1940s onwards, and they too can also be matte or glossy, so again not very helpful for identification. The white baryta layer which I showed earlier was found in some collodion and gelatin printed out prints from 1885, so if you have a print which has a chip sort of on the edge and you can see underneath the emulsion, if you can see a baryta layer, that's an aid to dating the photograph. So printed out print processes were the dominant processes of the 19th century. So now we come on to the developed out prints, and all developed out prints have a gelatin emulsion and are essentially one process, and they nearly all have a baryta layer. And by 1905 the sales of developed out prints was greater than that of printed out prints, and this was because they usually relied on artificial light, which was obviously more predictable, and the exposure times were much shorter, so the whole process was more controllable. Gelatin developed out paper continues to be used until the present day. Since the early 1900s there have been two optional additional developments which don't affect the heart of the silver process itself. The introduction of resin-coated paper in the mid-1970s as a cheaper alternative base, and the development of papers sensitive to laser light. Resin-coated paper is a plastic-coated paper, and the plastic coating contains a white pigment layer to replace the baryta. In recent years in contemporary photography, developing out paper on a traditional paper base rather than resin-coated paper has also become known as fibre base or baryta paper, and if you're producing good quality prints now for exhibition, that's probably what you'd use. And having paper sensitive to laser light means that they can be printed with digital files. Right, next up, the alternative processes. The alternative processes were so called because they were an alternative to silver processes, and the reason for their introduction was for stability and or artistic effect. Their peak in popularity was generally around 1900. They can be subdivided into two further groups: pigment processes and processes based on other metals. There are two main pigment processes, gum bichromate and carbon prints, and the difference is the binder. In gum bichromate it is gum arabic, and in carbon prints it is gelatin. They work in a very distinct physical as well as chemical way, and you can see here at the top you've got a printing paper which is coated with a mixture of binder and pigment and bichromate. And when light hits that, it causes the bichromate to harden the binder. And what happens if you then wash it is that the unhardened areas wash away. So you end up with a relief image. And where you have more binder, you have more pigment, and so that becomes a dark area. So a relief image, or at least more gloss in the darker areas, is a way of identifying them. Gun by chromate was a handmade process, often carried out by artists, and the relief or gloss was less distinct than perhaps with the carbon print. The carbon process used machine-made papers and usually involved a transfer to a second support. The carbon process came in over 60 colours, but was often produced in a chocolate colour to mimic gold-toned printed out prints, but it has usually retained its colour and contrast much better. The metal processes are all different, but the end result is that you have an image made of metal particles, or in the case of cyanotypes, an iron compound, Prussian blue. None of the metal processes have an emulsion. The cyanotype was introduced earlier than the other alternative processes in 1842 and was used primarily at that time for silhouettes of objects such as plants. It then re-emerged at the turn of the century when it was used more for industrial photography and some amateur photography, and in recent years it has been used as an art process. It is prone to fading in light, although that can be reversed in the dark. However, it also shows fading in alkaline conditions, and this is irreversible. The platinum print was invented in the 1870s and was around until World War I, when it became prohibitively expensive, although it was always an expensive process. It has a very fine and subtle tonal range, and it was frequently toned with a variety of other metals, which gave it a variety of hues. And it resurfaced again in the later 20th century as an art process. The process itself is fairly stable, but it does cause a brown degraded transfer image on adjacent paper or board over time, and this can be used again as an aid to identification. Research was carried out into the development of colour processes from the mid-19th century onwards, and several themes emerged. However, by far the most common colour prints are chromogenic prints, introduced in 1942. A small number were produced early on white pigmented cellulose acetate. However, the vast majority are produced on a paper base. And the chromogenic print was used for the typical snapshot as well as for professional photography, including art photography. Perhaps surprisingly, the process draws on black and white silver photography. What I'm giving you here is the bare essence of the process. So unexposed chromogenic printing paper has a gelatin emulsion containing 3 layers, and each of these layers contains silver halide plus part of either a cyan, magenta or yellow dye molecule respectively. After exposure to a colour negative, the silver image in the printing paper is developed, and the clever part is that during development the developer is oxidised and becomes the other part of the respective dye molecule. So dyes are therefore formed in areas of silver. The silver is then bleached out, leaving a multicolour dye image. As with silver black and white prints, there was a gradual switch to using resin-coated paper as a support, introduced in 1968 in the USA and 1970 in Europe. And it's worth noting that black and white images have increasingly been printed using the chromogenic process too. Like black and white silver prints, the papers have been adapted for exposure to laser light for digital files too. Dye images tend not to be as stable as pigment images. Dyes do not always break down at the same rate as each other, leading to colour shift. There can also be differences between dyes in dark storage and display. And in general, earlier chromogenic prints are less resistant to fading than later ones, but there were significant improvements in stability in the early 1980s. Resin-coated prints, particularly in the 1970s and early 80s, can themselves yellow and become brittle. Now, as far as other multicolour print processes are concerned, One of the first was the colour pigment print, and I'm afraid I don't have an image for that. But the process latterly involved superimposing cyan, magenta and yellow pigmented gelatin relief layers on top of each other onto a paper support, and it was a highly skilled job. Examples of these processes are Radex, introduced in 1913, Carbro 1921 and Vivex in 1931, and most had petered out by the 1950s and 60s. A well-known user of the process was Madame Yvonne, so if you want to look at some examples, I suggest you look at her work. They tend to survive in fairly good condition, but there may be the exception where the multiple layers and subsequent stresses have caused cracking or delamination at the edges. The next group of processes I want to talk about is the dye imbibition processes, and the most common of these is dye transfer. There were products produced in the early 1900s, but the most common was Kodak dye transfer, which was available from 1946 to 1993. 3 relief gelatin matrices are formed using different colour filters. However, they do not contain pigment but are immersed in cyan, magenta or yellow dye, and the amount of dye taken up is relative to the thickness of the gelatin. Each is then placed on an adapted paper coated with baryta and gelatin, which imbibes the dyes proportionately, and the paper typically has a white border. It was often used for art and advertising and is often in good condition, but it is susceptible to water damage. The next process I want to talk about is dye destruction, the main type being silver dye bleach. You're most likely to come across this process as sebachrome or ilfochrome, although there were some earlier ones. In this case, you start with a printing paper which contains dyes and silver halide. During development of the silver image, the dyes adjacent to silver particles are bleached in proportion to the amount of silver. The paper is then fixed and the silver removed. Sebachrome was introduced in 1963 and became ilfochrome in 1992, which was around until 2012. It was a more expensive process than chromogenic printing and produced sumptuous vivid colours with an almost metallic lustre, and many sebachromes or ilfochrome were glossy. It was initially made on pigmented white cellulose acetate and later on resin-coated paper or white pigmented or voided polyester. The dyes in sebachrome are more stable than chromogenic processes, although the papers are susceptible to abrasion. Dye diffusion processes involve the chemistry that is used in Polaroid photographs, although Kodak and Fuji had their own versions. There are 2 types: peel apart, where the image receiving support is peeled away from the negative to stop processing, or integral, where the layers are kept together. The former became the domain of professionals and the latter of amateurs. In black and white peel-apart versions, after exposure, the package is pulled through rollers in the camera, releasing an alkali solution. This develops the negative and allows the remaining silver halide in the undeveloped areas to transfer to a receiving layer, where they are developed into a positive. The negative and positive are then peeled apart. In colour peel-apart products, the package contains layers of dyes plus silver halide. After exposure and release of the alkali solution, the dyes act as developers and are immobilised in the process, but in non-exposed areas they are free to transfer to the receiving layer and form a positive. In integral packages, a white titanium dioxide layer is formed between the negative and positive during processing, which acts as a barrier and a white backdrop for the positive. Peel-apart images may have evidence of the way they were made, such as white spots at the edge of the image or delamination. And the stability of colour images is generally better than chromogenic images in the dark, but worse in the light. Well, I've covered quite a lot of ground in this webinar, and I hope you found some useful information to take away. We will be looking at some preservation issues related to prints in the last webinar, and I look forward to seeing you then.